Did you know? A couple of months ago, I was waiting to meet Mrs. Soup in town. While I waited, I fancied a treat, so I popped to a coffee shop near Newcastle University. Just as my order arrived, an American student walked past. He could smell the aroma of my coffee and breathed in deep. Then he said something peculiar. There's nothing quite like pulling the trigger on that first coffee of the day. Initially I was confused as to why he thought this was my first coffee of the day. It was, after all, the afternoon. But then something else occurred to me. What a curious turn of phrase. And I asked him, why? Why say pull the trigger on coffee? At this point, pun intended, he went ballistic, extolling the virtues of America and telling me that it's perfectly okay to have gun-related phrases. He somewhat frantically recited a manifesto of sorts, telling me how the gun was an inalienable right of the American people, written into the Constitution, how America's past was particularly violent, and therefore guns were just part of the culture. And finally he told me how throughout human history weapons have always existed. It was gun control that was unnatural and alien. Now it may well be that I just caught this guy on a bad day. Maybe he was busy, hot and bothered, and misunderstood what I was saying. But being me, I couldn't help but respond. "You're absolutely right," I said. "The Second Amendment gives you the right to bear arms. But this was written at a time when the state needed citizen militia to fend off invasion and to keep the peace, not in order to allow those citizens to have recreational armories." Speaking of British invasions, when it comes to violent history, Britain's certainly got form. In the annals of human history, this small group of islands off the northwest coast of Europe is arguably, consistently, one of the most brutally and unrelentingly violent places on the planet. Tribal violence, wars between kingdoms, international warfare, civil war. Heck, if we couldn't fight on our own soil, we'd export warfare. The Crusades are an incredibly violent period of our history. Not to mention the at times brutal legacy of the British Empire abroad. When it comes to a violent history, Britain outdoes America, and yet here, for the most part, guns are not seen as sexy. On the final point, I agree. Yes, weapons have been around since the earliest times, but it would be wrong to assume that a state of unchecked potential for violence is the natural state of affairs. Most human societies have limits on how and where violence can occur, but one of the best historical examples of this comes from ancient Catania in Sicily. This ancient, beautiful city was originally Greek, founded at the foot of Mount Etna around 730 BC. It was here that Charondas, a celebrated lawgiver, prescribed some very precise laws, some of which dealt with the handling of weapons in public. One day, Charondas had been out in the countryside when he was attacked by bandits, who he fought off with his dagger. Slightly shaken, but late for a meeting, he rushed back to town. When he arrived, someone pointed out that he had broken his own law, for he had not relinquished his dagger upon entering public assembly. So seriously was this law taken that Charondas immediately killed himself with the offending weapon. Now, I'm far from anti-American. I'm fascinated by American culture, and indeed Mrs. Soup and I want to visit there someday. In particular, we'd love to go to New Orleans. But it takes a certain willful blindness not to see that America has a problem with guns. And the fact that I received such an unprovoked and emotional response when even the hint of guns coming up in conversation occurred shows that some people are not thinking clearly about this issue. This is an incredibly emotional issue for some Americans. But if you're going to make the argument for guns, you need to make sure your arguments are valid. And you also need to acknowledge just how long people have been dying for gun control.